Welcome to the ungraded life, where there are no curriculum maps, no lesson plans, and no standardized tests. Just thought-provoking questions and ideas to ponder. Hey everyone, welcome back to our leadership series. Our focus during the month of April will be on inclusivity and perception. And while those terms might seem to be mutually exclusive, kind of standalone topics, they're actually deeply interconnected. Let's start with some popular images to make a point. What do you see when I shared this image? Now, if you say anything other than a duck or a rabbit, you might need to take a Rorschach test. Or how about this image? Do you see an old woman with a crooked nose or a younger woman wearing a ridiculous hat? Here's another popular image called Rubens' vase. And now that I've said vase, that's what you might see first. But you might also have seen the profiles of two faces looking at each other. The toughest example for me is the Necker cube. We have a two-dimensional drawing, but our brain wants to convert it to a three-dimensional perspective. The challenge is our brain can devise two different ways to accomplish this shift, and it often flips back and forth depending on where you place your focus. I can still remember seeing some of these images in a textbook when I was a teenager, and I suspect most people my age or older also remember them. I wonder now how common they are for the younger generation. Hell, Gen Z probably has versions that use motion or animation, which just would add nausea to the experience. To be clear, what you're seeing in those illusions is not mental trickery, as much as it is a window into how our brains construct reality. Ultimately, the point of this demonstration is to remind us that even though our brains are these exceptional meaning-making machines, that comes at a cost, because they can also make us prisoners of our own psyche, effectively restricting or preventing us from seeing what's right in front of us. You might be asking why or how this happens. According to experts in neuroscience and cognitive psychology, there are several reasons. First, our brains operate by using a top-down process that's designed to make predictions. So when we see an object or witness an event, our eyes aren't working in isolation and just, passively receiving some information. No, everything we see is being processed by our brain, and our brain is a prediction machine that makes all of its determinations or evaluations based on prior experience. So when you see an image like the ones I shared earlier, your eyes take in the visual input, but it's the brain's job to complete the process and make sense of the input. Its task is quite literally to remove any ambiguity within the input signal by adding a layer of meaning or recognition. And it does this by tapping into our memory, our expectations, or even context clues. Now, the images I shared are specifically designed to provide just enough information for your brain to grapple with multiple valid interpretations. So the reason that I might see one option at first while you see the other one is because our brain will lock onto a single prediction. And once it's done that, it resists switching. It assumes its job is done. It's important to point out, though, that changing the perception isn't impossible. You might have noticed that with some images, it's easier to switch to an alternative view than with others. Now, researchers call this phenomenon perceptual bistability, which is a fancy way of saying that when an image clearly supports more than one interpretation, the brain just can't hold both simultaneously. So it has to alternate between the two. And it triggers in this process a weird internal disagreement, right? A rivalry between the two options. Essentially, your neural networks are fighting for supremacy, and only one network can control consciousness at a time. So you can't see one interpretation without also conceding the other. And as for how your brain switches back and forth, an overly simplistic explanation comes from Gestalt psychology, which says that our brain operates by default settings. And one of those default settings requires our brain to consider what I'll say is the big picture first. It doesn't value the small parts equally. So instead of seeing a lot of separate pieces and observing how they work together, your brain automatically groups things together to achieve some semblance of order. Specifically, things bunched close together are assumed to be together. Things that look alike are assumed to be related to one another. If something is left open or appears to be left incomplete, our brains will actually close it to complete a previously seen shape. Our brain automatically determines what is foreground and what is background. And if you think about that for a little bit longer, what your brain is doing is deciding what's most important and what's least important at a speed so fast that we could only call it immediate. The second explanation for how our brains can construct a flawed reality is rooted in something that I've said about 1,000,000 times between the ungraded life in my classroom. And that's this: our brains are designed to be incredibly, almost miraculously efficient. Presumably related to our survival, the human brain is optimized for speed, which it achieves through brilliant pattern recognition. However, and this is very important, our brain is so preoccupied with processing speed that it doesn't concern itself with accuracy. Ironically, our brain does all the things we tell our children not to do when it comes to their learning process. So it uses shortcuts to get things done as quickly as possible. It's extremely biased about choosing the easiest interpretation. It refuses to accept when it makes a mistake. And lastly, it will not invest more time or try again unless it's forced to. Finally, the third reason our perception cannot fully be trusted is because our brain hates uncertainty or ambiguity. For those of you who subscribe to my Substack essays, you know I write about this a lot. When we encounter a situation, a problem, or even a person we don't recognize, it creates cognitive tension, something psychologists call dissonance. And our brain is so uncomfortable in that scenario that it just goes with the first interpretation it could come up with and deems that to be the truth of the situation. And as bad as that sounds, it's actually worse. Because not only does our psyche create its own interpretation, I want to say randomly and willy-nilly, I suppose someone would argue with that, but it's also incredibly stubborn about it. In fact, it defends that interpretation, even refusing in some cases to consider a legitimate alternate view of the situation. So, where are the leadership takeaways here? Well, we can improve the way we lead by remembering what we've learned about how our brain works. First, as open-minded as we might think we are, we don't see a situation with fresh perspective. We predict the meaning or the significance of the situation based on prior information or prior experiences. Therefore, it's important to remember that when we lack enough information or experience as it relates to the current input, our perception is very likely to be skewed. Secondly, multiple interpretations can coexist as equally valid, even if we can only see one at a time. Third, we default to the fastest or easiest interpretation, not the most complete or accurate one. And lastly, we cling to our perception of something not because it's right, but because it's stable. It brings us comfort. So let me try to land this plane. As a leader, you're often authorized to make decisions, to call shots, to drive change, to alter course. But if you're not pausing, pondering, taking in all the information that's available, forcing your brain from its default mode, then your perspective will feel like the ultimate reality when there's a good chance it isn't the only possible reality. And if that's how you're operating, you will deem your point of view as a singular, standalone truth, when in actuality, it's an analysis being done under specific constraints. If, as a leader, you are not willing to accept this reality about the blind spots that our brains possess, you will undoubtedly run into a lot more conflict with your team. For me, one of the best ways to register that I'm operating in a default mode is when an intelligent, well-educated, well-read, thinking person disagrees with me or provides me with a different point of view. Because in my opinion, an intelligent, well-educated, well-read thinker who pushes back on a plan I have or who wants to point out an error in my thinking isn't being irrational. They're providing me with a new way to see an image. On the flip side, if you're a leader who doesn't value input from others, who doesn't like to surrender the floor to someone with a different opinion, who thinks that your direct reports should just fall in line or carry that ours is not to wonder why, ours is just a do or die mentality. In the past, I would have said you're egomaniacal or you're lacking in humility. Honestly, I'd say that today. But also, from another perspective, I'm willing to recognize that you could be a victim of your own neurology. And now that you know the default settings and the rules by which your brain operates, I encourage you to slow down, pay attention, listen closely, observe carefully and consider all possibilities before reacting or making a decision. And trust me, your team will thank you. Thanks for spending such finite resources as your time and attention with us. For more content from The Ungraded Life, you can follow, like, and subscribe on most social media platforms.